Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into, well, one of the really critical and frankly uncomfortable contradictions in climate policy today. How can a wealthy, developed nation promise net zero emissions at home while at the same time staying one of the world's absolute biggest exporters of the fossil fuels, driving the whole problem?
It's a huge balancing act, isn't it? You've got this national climate pledge, often very political, very aspirational maybe, and then you slam it up against this massive economic reality, a reality that for some countries is foundational. We're looking at a system where, political borders dictate how carbon is counted, but the atmosphere, physics, they
Yeah,
just don't care about borders.
exactly. So the core mission for us in this deep dive, and we've looked at a lot of intensive analysis on this, it's really about confronting this, well, simple but kind of terrifying question. How honest, how credible is a nation's net zero promise if it has to basically ignore its single big carbon contribution, the one it profits from?
Yeah, and our source material, it really drills down into this. It's a meticulous, critical look at this policy gap. It uses Australia as the main case study, and it starkly contrasts the, let's say, political comfort of only counting domestic emissions territorial accounting against the harsh reality of global carbon piling up. The analysis is sharp, it's detailed, and it's pretty unforgiving about the consequences of looking the other way.
So our journey today is really about unpacking three connected and maybe uncomfortable truths that this analysis brings up. First, we need to really expose the kind of illusion of progress that the current carbon accounting rules allow. Second, we're going to look at what might be the most definitive measure of the crisis we have, the sheer mind-boggling amount of heat being soaked up by the oceans. And third, we'll pivot to those essential structural changes, the reforms, often politically tricky ones like nuclear energy, that have to be on the table if countries like Australia are serious about aligning their words with the science.
And we absolutely have to start by nailing down that central contradiction. It frames everything else. Australia commits to net zero by 2050, okay? But that commitment, explicitly, legally, it excludes the carbon released when all the coal and gas it exports gets burned overseas.
Right. And when you actually look at the scale of that exclusion,
Yeah.
I mean, it just stops being some technical detail. It becomes the whole story, doesn't it? We're talking exports that lead to roughly 1.2 billion tons of COO every year.
Mhm.
That's nearly triple the country's entire domestic emissions, which are, what, around 390 million tons?
Exactly. So you're looking at a political framework that basically chooses to ignore, roughly three-quarters of its actual global carbon footprint.
Which means that the domestic net zero goal and, all the political backpatting about progress toward it,
Mhm.
it looks way better than it really is when you measure it against, well, the planet's actual climate stability.
Hmm. And that deception, that difference, it brings us straight to the first big point of critique.
Yeah.
This illusion created by convenient accounting.
Okay, so let's unpack this loophole. It exists because the current international system, it really leans heavily on what's called territorial accounting. For listeners who might know the term but maybe not all the implications, what exactly is the difference between that and, say, consumption-based accounting? And why is that difference key here?
Right. So territorial accounting, that's the bedrock of the Paris Agreement. It just says emissions are counted where they physically happen, full stop. If Australia burns coal in a power plant within its borders, okay, that counts against its domestic budget, the 390 million tons. But if Australian coal gets shipped from, say, Newcastle to a power plant in Japan, all the CO that comes out when it's burned, that counts entirely on Japan's books. It's purely location-based.
So the country that digs it up, sells it, makes the money, and, enables the burning, gets a zero on its climate homework for that specific pollution.
Precisely. Zero climate impact on their official record for that activity. Now, consumption-based accounting, that tries to do the opposite. It attempts to assign the responsibility for emissions across the whole life cycle of a product or resource. So if Australia used consumption-based reporting, it would have to account for the carbon released when its coal and gas are actually burned by the countries that buy it. But the current system, the territorial one, lets Australia basically wash its hands of those emissions the moment the ship leaves port. And that creates this powerful illusion of progress back home.
And this is exactly where the source material starts talking about national hypocrisy. Because you get leaders in Canberra, sometimes in the same week. They're giving these big speeches at global climate meetings about net zero, but then they're also approving huge new LNG projects. And they often frame these gas projects as, transitional energy, necessary for the shift.
That transition argument is the main political shield, yes.
Hmm.
They'll argue, look, Australian gas is cleaner than the coal it might be replacing in Asia, or it's needed for energy security there. But the analysis we looked at really pushes back hard on that. It insists that, okay, maybe there's a short-term displacement effect sometimes, but the fundamental reality is the carbon from these massive exports is new load in the atmosphere. Period.
Hmm.
And that carbon, whether it's burned in Japan or South Korea or India or China, it adds to the exact same atmospheric concentration that's causing Australia's own problems.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? The profits from the exports help fund the national budget, sure, but the resulting global warming is literally killing the Great Barrier Reef, driving horrific heat waves, fueling those mega fires inside Australia.
Exactly. The science just makes that political distinction completely meaningless. The analysis really hammers this point. Kojiro is a well-mixed gas. It warms the planet just the same whether it comes out of a chimney in Brisbane or Beijing. The atmosphere doesn't care about the Paris Agreement's accounting rules. So from the planet's perspective, the distinction is pointless. It only matters to the political economy of the country selling the fuel.
Okay, let's dig into that political economy. Because the incentive to keep this selective accounting system must be huge. We need to get a sense of the sheer scale of these exports Australia is, in effect, protecting.
Oh, absolutely. We have to understand this. The fossil fuel export industry isn't just some side business. It's foundational to Australia's national wealth. Coal and LNG combined, they accounted for something like $225 billion in export value in the 2023-24 financial year. That's just massive. It's a colossal economic engine. It supports thousands of jobs, crucial infrastructure in regional areas, significant government royalties.
Wow, $225 billion. And what does that translate to in terms of global carbon pollution?
Well, the estimated total kilos released overseas when just those specific exported fuels were burned, it's somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 billion tons. Now put that against the global total. That single stream of exported fuel combustion represents nearly 3% of all global fossil fuels emissions.
Nearly 3% from one country's exports, a country whose own domestic emissions are relatively small on the global stage.
It's staggering, yes. Nearly 3% of the global problem originates from resources extracted and sold by this one nation, which then officially reports only its own much smaller fraction of a percent domestically.
Okay, I have to ask the obvious counter-argument here. While the physics is clear, isn't there a political reality? If Australia suddenly decided to count these exported emissions on its own books, wouldn't that just push buyers towards countries maybe less transparent, less regulated, who don't count them? Wouldn't it just shift the problem, not solve it?
That's the standard defense. You hear it all the time. But the source material argues against it pretty strongly. The authors say, okay, maybe some supply chain shift. But the main point of counting exported emissions isn't necessarily immediate global reduction. It's about transparency. It's about accountability. By refusing to count them, Australia loses any real moral high ground to pressure the big consuming nations to cut their emissions faster. And that argument, if we don't sell it, someone else dirty will, the analysis frames that as a moral cop-out, especially for a wealthy, technologically advanced G20 nation that could transition. So the conclusion is pretty blunt. This selective accounting lets the nation export the problem, pat itself on the back for tiny domestic cuts, and basically engage in what the authors call national self-deception. It stops real climate leadership.
And that self-deception, it really only works as long as we stay focused on political numbers, on election cycles. Our analysis insists, though, that if you want the real story, the unfiltered truth about warming, you have to look away from Canberra and look at the one place that doesn't engage in political spin. The oceans.
Absolutely. This is where we shift from, let's say, political math to hard physics. The oceans are the planet's giant heat sink, right? They are the single most accurate and frankly most alarming measure of human-caused climate change. The key fact here, the one that explains so much, is that over 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases ends up absorbed by the oceans, mostly the deep ocean.
And that detail, 90%, is hidden underwater. That's why just looking at air temperatures can be a bit misleading sometimes, isn't it? Most of the energy imbalance is stored away, which kind of delays the worst atmospheric effects, but locks in these huge long-term changes. So what does the data show? How fast, how much heat are we talking about? Give us those big numbers, a real wow moment from the analysis.
The scale is genuinely hard to comprehend. The data compiled roughly between 2013 and 2023, it suggests the oceans absorbed about 10 zettajoules of heat every single year. Now, a zettajoule, that's 10 followed by 21 zeros, 2,121 joules. Just an unimaginably vast amount of energy. If you break that down daily, it works out to something like 27 quintillion joules being absorbed by the oceans every day.
27 quintillion joules a day. That number just sounds unreal. It almost loses meaning. So to try and make that tangible for us, let's use that energy imbalance analogy from the analysis. Let's compare that ocean heat uptake to, say, all the energy humans use globally each day.
Right, this comparison really hits home, I think. It illustrates the scale of the problem better than almost anything else. So humanity's total daily energy consumption from all sources, cars, power plants, heating, industry, everything, is roughly 1.6 times 10 to the power of 18 joules. That's 1.6 exajoules. That's everything we use to run our civilization for a day.
Okay, so we compare 1.6 times 10 to the 18 against 27 times 10 to the 18 joules going into the ocean daily. That math works out too. The oceans are absorbing about 17 times more heat every day than all of humanity uses in energy.
17 times. That's the staggering conclusion. It's undeniable proof that the planet is accumulating heat energy much, much faster than it can radiate it back out to space. The whole system is fundamentally out of balance, and that enormous amount of energy is being stored mostly deep in the world's oceans.
17 times our total energy use just being absorbed. What kind of energy revolution, what scale of change would we need just to stop adding more heat, let alone fix the problem we've already created? Did this source give any other comparison to grasp that scale?
Yeah, the analysis used another striking analogy. It's the energy imbalance. That extra heat accumulating is equivalent to detonating about 4 large Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs every single second, continuously.
4 bombs a second.
That's the rate of energy gain. It means even if we achieved global net zero emissions tomorrow morning, the climate system, especially the oceans, would still be dealing with that stored heat for centuries, millennia even. To actually rebalance the energy budget quickly would require not just switching energy sources, but actively pulling massive amounts of CO2 out of the air, which we can't do at scale, or resorting to highly risky geoengineering, like trying to make the planet more reflective. The physics has locked us into a certain amount of consequence already.
Okay, so this huge hidden heat storage. The analysis then explains what it means at a really small level. This tiny, almost unnoticeable daily temperature rise that adds up.
Exactly. It's all about the cumulative effect. Think about just 1 cubic meter of seawater. That's about a ton of water. On average, every day, that single cubic meter absorbs about 20 joules of extra heat. Now, that only translates to a temperature increase of about 5 microdegrees Celsius per day. That's 5 millionths of a degree. Annually, it's about 0.00018 degrees Celsius. Tiny.
5 microdegrees. I mean, that sounds like absolutely nothing. Why even mention such a minuscule increase?
Because you have to multiply that tiny, tiny increase by the total volume of the oceans, roughly 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water. And when you do that, the total added heat drives some of the biggest climate impacts we see. Most critically, it causes sea level rise simply through thermal expansion.
Can you explain that a bit more? Thermal expansion versus, say, melting glaciers, which is what most people probably think of for sea level rise.
Yeah, sure. So melting glaciers and ice sheets, that adds more water to the oceans, increasing their total mass. That's definitely a big contributor. But thermal expansion is different. It's about the volume the existing water takes up. When water gets warmer, even slightly warmer, its molecules move faster, vibrate more, and take up a tiny bit more space. Now, water doesn't expand much when heated, but apply that effect to the colossal volume of the deep oceans, which hold most of the planet's water and are absorbing 90% of the heat. That slight expansion in every cubic meter adds up to a really significant increase in the total ocean volume. It's pure physics. Heat adds volume.
And that added heat energy doesn't just raise sea levels, right? It fuels stronger storms, it messes with ocean currents. Changes that, as the analysis points out, no election cycle or policy tweak can just reverse.
Exactly. The heat is destabilizing the whole system. It confirms the problem isn't some abstract model, it's measured physics. And the root cause of this relentless heating, measured so clearly by the oceans, is that persistent energy imbalance we talked about, around 0.8 to 1.0 watts per square meter, averaged over the entire planet's surface. That's the net difference between the solar energy Earth absorbs and the heat energy it manages to radiate back out.
And that 0.8 William-Nodafi difference is caused primarily by
Primarily by the blanket effect of the elevated greenhouse gases, especially CO, trapping that outgoing heat. The oceans are acting as a buffer, slowing down how fast the air temperature rises, which is maybe politically convenient in the short term, but they're doing it by locking in these massive long-term changes that will affect the planet for literally thousands of years.
Okay, so we've got the speed of the crisis right now, measured by the oceans. But the other huge problem the analysis brings up is the longevity issue, how long this carbon pollution sticks around. This takes us into thinking about the generational debt, the inescapable legacy of the fossil fuel era.
Yeah, the history here is crucial because it really highlights the permanence of this problem. We have to remember where we started. Go back to around 1750, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Atmospheric co-Euros was stable at about 280 parts per million ppm. It had been around that level for a very long time.
And the rise since then has just been relentless.
Absolutely relentless. By 2025, we've blown past 422 ppm. That's a 50% increase in just under 300 years. It's unprecedented in human history, probably in millions of years. And that total accumulation, the extra COs we've added since 1750, it's estimated at more than 1.6 trillion tons. That number is so vast, it's hard to grasp. It really forces you to accept this isn't a problem solvable in one government term, right? Or even one generation.
It's truly sobering. We've built up this massive atmospheric debt in what's basically a blink of an eye, geologically speaking. Now, the analysis makes a really key point, distinguishing QROs from other greenhouse gases like methane. Why is the QROs from these exported fossil fuels seen as such a permanent debt, unlike methane?
It comes down to the atmospheric chemistry and how long these gases last. Methane is potent, yes, but it breaks down relatively quickly in the atmosphere, mostly oxidizing into co-Euro and water over, say, a decade or two. Co-Euro, however, is much more stable. It doesn't really break down chemically in the air. While a lot of it gets absorbed gradually by oceans and land forests, soils over centuries, a significant chunk stays airborne for much longer. The analysis highlights that about 20%, one-fifth of every ton of co-Euro emitted today will still be in the atmosphere, trapping heat 1,000 years from now.
1,000 years. So the coal and gas being shipped out of Australia today, generating profits today,
Yeah.
that carbon will still be influencing the planet's temperature long after the mines are exhausted, the executives are gone, the ports have crumbled. That really reframes these exports. It's not just current economic activity, it's actively shaping the climate for millennia.
That is precisely the moral and scientific debt the source material insists we confront. We are fundamentally, and for all practical purposes, permanently altering the planet's energy balance. And yet, nations continue to profit enormously from the very activity causing this multi-millennial disruption. That's why the sheer persistence of co-Euros means those tiny microdegree increases in ocean heat aren't just abstract data points. The analysis calls them thermodynamic evidence of a collective failure. A failure to truly grasp the long-term consequences of prioritizing short-term economic gain.
It makes Australia's whole net zero pledge, which, as we've said, hinges on ignoring most of the carbon it enables globally, look fundamentally shaky. Ethically questionable in the long run, given its massive contribution to this permanent atmospheric burden. But this forces the next question. If the problem's locked in, if it's persistent, and if the current political approach is, well, deceptive, what actual structural changes are needed inside Australia? How can it genuinely decarbonize? And that brings us, inevitably, to the elephant in the room, the nuclear question.
Yes, Section 4 really zooms in on that domestic structural challenge. The source material is quite blunt here. It argues that if Australia is genuinely serious about deep decarbonization, it simply has to break its long-held political taboo and confront the nuclear energy question head-on. It's an acknowledgement that the physics of a stable grid requires reliable, baseload power.
And Australia really does seem like an outlier globally on this, doesn't it? You look around, the US, the UK, Canada, France, many countries in Europe, even places like Japan and South Korea, they've either kept nuclear as part of their mix or are actively planning to include it, often scaling it up, as essential for a credible net zero future. Yet in Australia, the debate feels stuck, frozen.
That's exactly the observation. The global challenge is how you replace baseload fossil fuels, primarily coal and gas, which provide power 247. If you rely only on intermittent renewables like solar and wind, you need absolutely enormous amounts of energy storage batteries, pump hydro, other things to cover the gaps when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And building that much storage is incredibly expensive and resource intensive, especially at the scale needed for a whole national grid. That's where modern nuclear technology comes into the picture.
Okay, let's detail the specific advantages the analysis points to for modern nuclear. We're not talking about Chernobyl-era reactors here, right? This is generation 30-plus designs and these emerging small modular reactors, SMRs. What do they offer Australia specifically?
Well, the primary benefit is straightforward. They provide genuine, carbon-free baseload power. A typical large nuclear plant can run at over 90% capacity factor. That means it's generating reliable power almost constantly. Compare that to solar, maybe 20–25% capacity factor on average, or wind, maybe 30–40% depending on the location. Nuclear provides that stability. Plus, these modern SMRs, they're designed differently. They're smaller, intended to be largely built in factories, and then assembled on-site in modules. This could potentially make them faster to build and less risky financially than the giant plants of the past. They also offer very high reliability and take up a tiny physical footprint compared to the vast areas needed for equivalent solar or wind farms plus storage.
So SMRs could potentially address some of the old criticisms about cost, construction time, and maybe even safety protection, while delivering that firm, continuous zero-carbon power the grid needs.
That's the argument, yes. They directly address the intermittency problem that comes with relying solely on renewables. The analysis suggests that if Australia wants to decarbonize rapidly and reliably, it likely needs both a massive build-out of renewables and a firm, dispatchable, zero-carbon source like nuclear. The outright refusal to even consider nuclear is seen by the authors as putting ideology ahead of pragmatic engineering and grid reliability.
And the source uses a pretty powerful real-world example to show this isn't just theory, right?
Indeed, the French example is always the go-to case study, and for good reason. France generates over 70%, sometimes closer to 75% of its electricity from nuclear power. It's basically definitive proof, the analysis argues, that low-carbon prosperity is achievable without economic collapse. France has one of the cleanest electricity grids among major developed economies. It shows that a modern, industrialized nation can power itself reliably and relatively affordably without massive carbon emissions by leaning heavily on nuclear technology.
Yet back in Australia, the political opposition remains strong. The source describes it as resting on outdated fears and political inertia.
Yeah, that inertia is deep-seated. The analysis acknowledges historical concerns about waste disposal and safety, but argues that modern reactor designs and highly stringent global regulatory standards have substantially addressed these. But the core issue identified is the political refusal to even allow nuclear to be part of the discussion about the future energy mix alongside renewables, storage, efficiency, grid upgrades. It's often shut down before the conversation starts. The authors frame this refusal as an abdication of responsibility. They argue it prioritizes comfortable political slogans and avoids tough choices, rather than grappling with the hard physics of transitioning a continent's entire energy system off fossil fuels.
A refusal, really, to consider all the tools in the toolbox when facing what we've established is an existential multi-millennial challenge, which underscores that this transition isn't just about domestic grids. It's deeply connected to global power dynamics. So if we zoom out again, we have to look at how energy policy is foreign policy, which brings us to the geopolitics and the enduring power of oil and gas.
That's a crucial lens, yes. Because even while many nations talk about decarbonization, the reality on the ground is that oil, gas, and coal still hold this enormous, almost gravitational influence over international relations. Control over these resources, or access to them, continues to shape military strategies, dictate sanctions, forge alliances, and, depressingly often, trigger conflicts.
The source material really emphasizes this point that fossil fuels effectively remain the main currency of geopolitics. They determine leverage, coercion. How does the analysis illustrate that?
Well, it points to ongoing global situations. Look at the Middle East. Despite decades of turmoil and efforts by consuming nations to diversify away, its strategic importance still fundamentally hinges on global oil dependency. Access to those energy resources is still viewed by major powers as a core national security interest. Non-negotiable, really.
And the analysis also uses the flip side, countries with huge reserves, but without the geopolitical clout.
Exactly. The case of Venezuela is presented as a stark example. It sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia. Yet the country is an economic basket case, crippled by sanctions, mismanagement, and political isolation. Its situation just highlights how deeply fossil energy is tangled up with global power structures. It's not enough just to have the oil. You need the political and economic integration to wield it as strategic leverage. Fossil fuels grant power, but they also create intense dependencies and vulnerabilities.
So for an exporting nation like Australia, the analysis points to this two-sided dilemma. What are those conflicting incentives it faces?
Well, first, there's that stark, unavoidable conflict between immediate financial gain, that huge $225 billion export figure we mentioned, and long-term climate principle. As long as the global economy runs primarily on fossil fuels, the temptation, the sheer economic pressure to keep exporting is immense. It fuels that national self-deception we talked about earlier.
And the second part of the dilemma is the risk created by not diversifying the domestic energy system fast enough, by sticking with the fossil fuel export model too long.
Precisely. The source calls this a major strategic liability. If Australia drags its feet on its own energy transition, if it keeps betting its economic future primarily on exporting coal and gas, it risks being left high and dry.
Yeah.
Because major markets think the EU with its carbon border tax, but increasingly key Asian partners too, they are moving however slowly towards decarbonization. Demand for Australian coal and gas will eventually decline, maybe faster than predicted. So delaying the transition isn't just bad climate policy. The analysis frames it as a failure of long-term economic foresight, a failure to secure the nation's future prosperity in a changing world.
Okay, so we have the scientific debt piling up in the oceans, the massive economic incentive to ignore it, the geopolitical risks of clinging to the old model, and the structural need for change, including facing difficult options like nuclear. Now we need to talk about how this all gets filtered through the political process, which the source rather vividly calls climate kabuki.
Climate kabuki, yeah. It's a cutting phrase the analysis uses to describe what it sees as this political theater of commitment that masks inaction, especially in Canberra. The argument is that the political system has become very adept at performing climate action, making symbolic gestures without actually implementing the deep, often costly policy changes required.
What are some examples of this performance?
Well, you see governments commissioning these big, glossy reports, net zero pathways, future fuel strategies, often with lots of fanfare. But then a change of minister, or a change of government, or just perceived political difficulty, and the reports get quietly shelved. The hard recommendations are ignored. You also see endless debates about technical definitions, like arguing about baseload versus dispatchable power, which can sound very serious and engaged, but often serve to delay actual investment decisions and concrete planning. These technical arguments can become a substitute for making the tough calls on infrastructure, investment, and regulation needed for the transition.
And the source is really clear that all this political maneuvering avoids the core truth. No technology can offset Australia's exported emissions without fundamental structural reform. You can't just tweak around the edges.
That's the bottom line, yes. The analysis argues that the science is fundamentally apolitical. The laws of physics, the heat balance of the planet, they don't care about political ideologies or election promises. Yet, climate policy consistently gets treated as an electoral wedge, a tool used to differentiate parties, to rally the base, to attack opponents, rather than being treated as the long-term existential challenge that requires a unified, consistent approach.
The physical reality, as we've discussed, is starting to bite back harder. The analysis points out that Australia's worsening heat waves, the coral bleaching, the droughts, these aren't just unfortunate events. They are direct physical feedback. They are the real-world cost of political delay.
Right. Those micro degrees of ocean warming we talked about, viewed through this lens, become a measure of Canberra's macro-level failure to act decisively. And this sense of urgency leads the source material to lay out 5 specific policy imperatives, 5 concrete structural steps it argues Australia must take if it wants to align its rhetoric with reality.
Okay, let's go through these 5 imperatives. Number 1 is about honesty in measurement, achieving real accounting transparency.
This is seen as foundational for any credibility. Australia needs to start including its exported emissions in its national climate reports. Maybe not for binding targets immediately, but at least for transparent reporting and voluntary target setting. This would force the national conversation to grapple with the real scale of the country's global carbon footprint, that 1.2 billion ton figure, not just the 390 million domestic one. The authors argue this is just essential for regaining international trust.
Imperative number 2 tackles that domestic energy blind spot we discussed, establishing a comprehensive nuclear framework.
Yes. To make zero-carbon baseload power a genuine option for the future, the country needs to act now to create the enabling framework. This means reforming the laws that currently ban nuclear power, streamlining the regulatory and approval processes for modern designs like SMRs, and starting a serious fact-based public conversation about it. The goal isn't necessarily to build reactors tomorrow, but to make nuclear a viable option that can be properly assessed alongside renewables and storage, instead of being politically off-limits.
The third imperative brings us back to the physical reality check, investing seriously in climate monitoring.
acknowledging that ocean heat content is the most robust indicator of planetary warming. Australia, as a major maritime nation surrounded by oceans critical to global climate, needs to significantly ramp up its investment in oceanography and climate science infrastructure. This isn't just about science, it's about ensuring policy is grounded in the best possible understanding of how quickly the environment is actually changing, rather than relying on potentially lagging or politically convenient metrics.
Fourth imperative recognizes the global context, a necessary foreign policy reorientation.
Canberra needs to strategically adjust its foreign and trade policies to prepare for, and ideally shape, the global shift away from fossil fuels. This means proactively planning for declining demand for its coal and gas exports, while simultaneously positioning itself to be a leader in supplying the critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, that are essential for batteries, EVs, and renewable technologies. It's about anticipating the new geopolitics of clean energy.
And finally, the fifth imperative aims to break the cycle of political short-termism, the call for a durable bipartisan accord on climate.
This is about getting climate policy out of the destructive cycle of being torn up and rewritten every election. The proposal is to create a long-term, binding national climate agreement, perhaps modeled on past successful bipartisan reforms like the economic reforms of the 80s and 90s, which set stable frameworks that endured across governments. The idea is to depoliticize the long-term targets and transition pathways, providing the certainty needed for massive private investment.
That bipartisan accord sounds essential, honestly. But given the political polarization you just described, how realistic is it? Does the source suggest any actual mechanism to make it stick, to stop one government simply undoing the last one's plan?
That's the key challenge, isn't it? The analysis suggests it needs a mechanism that takes the implementation out of direct day-to-day political control once the broad goals are agreed upon. One idea floated is establishing an independent statutory authority, like the Reserve Bank perhaps, with experts appointed for long terms, tasked specifically with managing the emissions reduction pathway according to the agreed long-term targets, irrespective of the government of the day. It's about embedding the policy structurally, making it harder to unravel for short-term political gain. That's seen as maybe the only way to effectively manage a problem that spans decades and centuries.
So these 5 steps together, the analysis concludes, represent the minimum credible path for Australia to, well, regain legitimacy on the world stage and show it's serious about tackling its full climate impact, not just the convenient domestic part. It's about finally facing the true cost of its current economic model.
It really forces a choice, doesn't it? Does Australia want to be seen as part of the global solution? Or does it continue to be, arguably, one of the largest per capita enablers of the problem among wealthy nations?
Which brings us right back to where we started. Let's try and synthesize the core message of this deep dive. Net zero by 2050, or any target date. It just doesn't mean much if you deliberately exclude the lion's share of the carbon you dig up, sell, and profit from.
The atmosphere simply doesn't care. It's relentless. It doesn't recognize export terminals or accounting conventions. Those oceans warming relentlessly by those tiny fractions of a degree every day, they are the irrefutable proof. Every ton of coal-ures, whether it comes from a power station in Queensland or a steel mill in Guangdong using Australian coal, it adds to the same global burden, the same persistent planetary heat imbalance.
And the source really frames Australia's situation not as a lack of technology. The solutions, renewables, storage, even nuclear, they exist or are developing rapidly. The core problem is presented as fundamentally a moral and political one. A lack of political courage, really, to look beyond the next quarterly earnings report or the next election and confront the uncomfortable long-term arithmetic of its fossil fuel exports.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to chew on. A provocative one, perhaps. If a nation, or indeed the world, continues to measure climate progress only by the metrics that look good, that flatter national narratives, focusing only on domestic emissions while ignoring the vast exported component, then the planet's physical systems, the oceans, the ice sheets, the atmosphere itself, will eventually provide a much more honest accounting. An accounting recorded not in reports, but in irreversible changes to the world we depend on. So the question becomes, what is the true ultimate cost measured in submerged coastlines, lost ecosystems, human displacement, of delaying an honest global conversation about all emissions, simply because facing the full truth today is economically inconvenient and politically difficult?